CSS Grid is incredibly powerful for layout designs, but it has limitations when it comes to complex nested structures. By default, the row and column tracks set on a parent grid only apply to its immediate children, which can make it tricky to align nested elements. CSS Subgrid solves this by allowing nested grids to inherit the parent grid's configurations, like grid tracks, named areas, or named lines, making it much easier to align nested grid items with the parent grid tracks. In this video, we will dive deep into CSS subgrids and explore a real-life example of a widely used design pattern. Welcome to Optimistic Web, where we explore the world of CSS and front-end development, one step at a time. To understand the problem that CSS Subgrid addresses, let's look at this grid setup. We have a grid container with the first 3 child items placed directly within it, while the last 3 items are nested inside another container. In the CSS, the parent grid is set up with 4 rows of 100 pixels each. The columns are based on the autofill feature, where the minimum width of a column track is 100 pixels, and the maximum is set to 1 FR. On the front end, the pink boxes are direct children of the parent grid, while the yellow ones are nested within the subgrid container. If we bring in the grid inspector, we can see that the first 3 items are aligned perfectly because they're direct children of the grid, but the subgrid items are packed within a single grid cell. Let's move the subgrid to another row so it can have enough space to expand. But what if our design requires these subgrid items to follow the parent grid structure? One solution could be to modify the HTML and remove the nested layout, but that's not always feasible in real-world scenarios. Sometimes, the layout is complex enough that nested elements can't be avoided. CSS Subgrid can seamlessly handle these kinds of design inconsistencies. First, we need to define the subgrid as a grid container. There won't be any visible difference yet because we still need to configure the track sizing. One option is to replicate the same setup used for the parent grid. However, we would then have to carefully configure the subgrid columns to align precisely with those of the parent, including the gaps. Although it seems to be working fine in this case, it's not that simple in real-life projects. With the subgrid, we can update grid template columns to indicate that instead of creating a new set of tracks, the subgrid should inherit the column tracks defined in the parent grid. It's not required to use a subgrid for both dimensions. For instance, we can apply it only to column tracks while keeping custom settings for row tracks, or we can configure both axes to follow the parent grid setup. In this case, both columns and rows are set to inherit their parent grid configuration. Now, even if we remove the gap property, it will still be fine, or we can adjust the gap to have a different value if needed. As mentioned earlier, a subgrid can inherit named areas and lines. For example, we can add custom names to the parent grid lines, and then the subgrid can easily reference these names for placement. In this case, the subgrid is positioned at the 3rd column grid line using a custom name defined in the parent grid. Then, the first child of the subgrid is moved to the 3rd position, while the second child is moved to the 1st, both following the custom names inherited from the parent grid. Although the subgrid can inherit named grid lines, the line numbers remain independent. As shown in the grid inspector, line numbers for the main grid run from 1 to 7, whereas the subgrid is numbered from 1 to 5. So don't be confused when using line numbers in your CSS. While Subgrid offers many benefits, it does have its limitations. It cannot generate auto tracks. As we saw in our previous video, grid auto rows and grid auto columns are helpful when you need to auto-place items without knowing the exact number of items in advance. But this isn't possible with a subgrid. Take a look at the example. The subgrid is trying to place 3 items into 2 grid cells. Since the subgrid can't create auto rows, the last item is overlapping. To avoid this, we can explicitly assign more cells to the subgrid. Now that we have covered the theory, let's see how we can work with the subgrid in a real project. In our HTML, we have a container holding several content boxes, and each content box contains an icon, a heading, a brief description, and a call to action. Coming to the CSS, we will set up the parent element as a grid container. Once again, we will use the AutoFit keyword to create a responsive grid of boxes where the minimum width of a column track will be either 100% or 300 pixels, whichever is smaller, and the maximum will be 1 FR. This means that if the available space is over 300 pixels, the minimum will be set. Otherwise, 100% will be used for the minimum value. It's a nice way to create a responsive layout without using media queries. After applying some presentational styles, this is what the front end looks like. It's a commonly used design pattern that we see on almost every other website. It looks nice, consistent, and perfectly aligned because each box has the same amount of content. However, in practice, user-generated content can vary significantly. For instance, one content box might have a short sentence, while another could contain a lengthy paragraph. Similarly, one box may have a single-line heading, whereas another could have a heading that spans multiple lines. This variation makes it challenging to maintain perfect alignment across the boxes. Like in this example, we can see that inconsistent content breaks the overall alignment. This kind of display can be a nightmare for designers. In the past, we often used various hacks, such as setting a fixed height, using margin auto, or creating a nested grid to achieve an optimal layout across different devices. However, these solutions tend to result in messy code that is difficult to maintain. As we have seen, CSS Subgrid allows nested grid items to participate in the sizing of the tracks defined in their parent grid. We can apply a similar approach to address such layout inconsistencies. In addition to setting the parent container as a CSS grid, each individual content box will also need to be defined as a grid. Each box should consist of 4 rows, for the icon, heading, description, and the CTA. Note that we are still not using the subgrid. The rows defined for the content boxes remain independent of the parent grid. While this approach has fixed the button placement, the problem with the multi-line headings is still there. What we can do is, instead of using nested grids, we can leverage the powerful subgrid. However, as soon as we apply the subgrid, it breaks the layout. It's because we haven't defined any row tracks for the parent grid. So let's add grid template rows to the parent element, but the layout remains broken. When we check this with the grid inspector, we see that the first 2 rows are filled with content, while the last 2 remain empty. The fact is, we don't need to define any explicit row tracks for the parent grid. It will automatically add as many rows as necessary, even if we remove that line. We actually need these rows for the subgrid. Therefore, each content box should span 4 rows, so that each element inside the box can occupy its own row. This simple change significantly enhanced the consistency of the layout across content boxes. Since the subgrid inherits the gap property from the parent grid, we can reset it to 0 to eliminate any extra spacing between the rows. With just these 3 lines, grid row span 4, display grid, and grid template rows subgrid, we have successfully resolved the layout issues caused by variable length content. Now, each box spans 4 rows, and the parent grid automatically adds as many rows as necessary. Every nested element is aware of one another and adjusts its position accordingly, maintaining perfect synchronization. The subgrid ensures that the nested items, such as paragraphs and buttons, start in the same rows, maintaining consistency across all boxes. This results in a cleaner, more organized layout, where each element is aligned regardless of varying content lengths. There's another popular use case for subgrids is using named grid lines to create full bleed sections. If you're looking to break out of a fixed width container for a dramatic, wide-spanning effect, Subgrid can be a solution. Check out this video to see how it's done. And if you're diving deeper into CSS Grid, I've got more videos to help you master layout techniques. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and feel free to leave your questions or comments below. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.